Escape and Evasion, the Blood Chit story of World War II. Have you ever been somewhere where no one spoke your language? I'm not talking about the local Walmart. I'm talking about a whole nother country. It can be exciting. It can be fun. It can be frustrating, trying to communicate with people who don't speak your language. My wife and I volunteered to teach English in China for 7 summers. We took our young son, who would go to school in the fall and tell his friends that he went to English camp in China. They wouldn't believe him. But English camp in China, when my wife and I were going from 2004 on, was a big deal. After 2 weeks of teaching, we would go sightseeing. So they would send over 3 or 4 teaching teams of Americans, 25 to 30 of us in a group, divided into 6 teaching classes. And afterwards, no matter what country you went or what city you went to, we would all go back to Beijing. We taught 3 summers in Fuzhou, 3 summers in Shanghai, Datong, and Fuzhou. And at the end of those teaching periods, we would all go to Beijing and we'd see the Great Wall and the Tiananmen Square, the Forbidden City, and there would be souvenir vendors there. Now, these vendors could speak a little bit of English, but if you went to a grocery store looking for something, you're on your own. We would have a lesson on American food, and usually we could find jelly and peanut butter, but it didn't say jelly and peanut butter on the label. And I was looking at this one jar and I took a picture of it and went back to my interpreter and I said, is this really peanut butter? He said, oh no, that's hot sauce. I said, okay, thank you. You saved me an expense there. He says, you want peanut butter? He comes back the next day with a jar of peanut butter. It's all in Chinese, except for right on the label. It says in English, peanut butter. But more about souvenirs later. Suppose there's a war going on. All right, this is December 7th, 1941, the date that will live in infamy. And this is an actual December 7th newspaper, especially on the East Coast. Most of them were dated December 8th, the following day, the Monday. And the headline, I think, is a little misleading. Naval battle off of Hawaii. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and then they left. And that was, well, I'll comment more about that later. So suppose there's a war going on and you're an airman and you find yourself in a foreign country in unfamiliar territory. You don't speak the language. You might be injured. You might be wounded. You don't know who to trust. How are you going to communicate and find people who are willing to help you? This is the circumstances pilots and aircrew find themselves in. They train for just a situation, but it depends on their ability to communicate with strangers who might be afraid of them, but willing to help, or they might be angry and hostile. The airman's last hope of evading capture and returning to friendly forces lies in a single device known as a blood chit, a piece of cloth written in the local language, promising a reward for assistance and safe return. So here's an example of a blood chit. When I first started collecting blood chits, my wife said to me, "What are you saying?" I said, "Blood chit." She says, "Can you call it something else?" I said, "That's what it's called, all right?" So this is an example of a 7-language blood chit with an American flag on it. Definition: blood chit, also known as a rescue patch. I could call it a rescue patch, but that wouldn't be as exciting. A device issued by government to aircrew members bearing a message in one or more languages that identifies the bearer as a member of a particular military establishment and promises a reward. That's from the book that I have on display here, Blood Chit Story, Last Hope, the Blood Chit Story. So where does the term blood chit come from? It is a strange term. Chit is an English word, as in the country England, meaning an IOU, a note of a sum owed. A 1945 report by the Army Air Force Training Command stated, it has been pointed out that the term blood could be interpreted as life. Hence the term blood chit, meaning a sort of IOU for one's life. My father worked at Western Electric. He's passed on now, but he was an electrician, and he was issued a chit that he carried with him. And if he needed a special tool to repair a piece of equipment, he would turn his chit into the tool cage. They would give him the tool. At the end of the day, when he returned the tool, he got his chit back, an IOU. It was clear from the very beginning that aviators would have difficulty communicating because they'd be traveling over and landing in other countries. A Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Blachard was a balloonist who came to America in 1793. On January 9th, here in Philadelphia, he flew from Walnut Street. I've seen Chestnut Street and Market Street. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Walnut Street, with his little black dog. He was flying an American flag from his balloon, and George Washington and 4 other future presidents were there to witness this event. He flew 15 miles in 45 minutes and landed in New Jersey. He did not speak English. He was given a document from President Washington guaranteeing him his safety, stating that this man is a Frenchman to receive him with goodwill and provide him with any necessary aid. When he landed, he presented his document to a farmer, and the farmer could not read. And that's an ongoing theme. I'll be mentioning that even in World War II, that the pilots had difficulty finding people who could read. But the farmer became friendly when he offered him a bottle of wine. This is a paper blood chit. If the crew whose aircraft landed in your region are taken safely to the nearest government post or military base, you will be given a large reward. All right, so that is incentive for people to help downed pilots and airmen. Thought to be the first aviator's blood chit, it may have been issued as early as 1917 to British pilots in India. The Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937. The Chinese bought American aircraft and recruited American military pilots to help them defend themselves against the Japanese. And it wasn't just Americans, but anyone who had military experience. They recruited French and German pilots and other European countries as well to come to their assistance. Forming the Volunteer Bombardment Squadron, VBS, which only existed for a couple months from November 1938 to March 1939. So why is there a Chinese flag on the blood chit in this photograph? When this photo was taken in 1937, the United States was not at war. Both of these young pilots were later killed in plane crashes, one in 1939 and the other in 1942. Also note that the blood chit is being worn on the front of the flight jacket. Most wore theirs on the back. In 1941, the American Volunteer Group, and this is still before Pearl Harbor, known as the Flying Tigers, was formed, and the blood chits they carried became immortalized forever in the minds of many Americans. They have become legends and symbolized for all time of the American character. A special blend of compassion, self-sacrifice, and willingness to help defend others from aggression and tyranny. One problem the Americans faced before the issuing of chits was that many Chinese didn't know what a Japanese pilot looked like and assumed that any downed airman was an enemy. Another problem was most Chinese in the countryside couldn't read. They didn't even know what a Chinese flag looked like. So these people were peasants. They just lived out in the fields and they were very ignorant, you know? And they didn't know what a Westerner looked like. So they just assumed they must be Japanese and they must be the enemy. So this is what a flying tiger blood chit looked like. You read from right to left down. Come, China, help fight. Foreign person, American. And this is a rubber stamp. All the rest of this is hand printed. Soldier, civilian. So they're talking to the Chinese now. One body. It means all together. Deliver and protect this pilot. The smaller column of 5 characters identifies the chit as being issued by the nationalist government's Commission on Aeronautical Affairs. The commission was headed by Madam Chiang Kai-shek, and that the Aero Commission CHOP, it's like you get a notary public and they stamp your paper with their symbol. A CHOP is a seal or stamp used in lieu of signatures on documents to make it official. The last column says serial number. Since the chits are official government documents, they're written in classical Chinese and not in the vernacular. Madam Chiang was educated in the US and she went on a speaking tour in 1943 to gain support for China. She is very popular in the US and lived to be 105. The 2 characters in parentheses are translated in English as Mei Guo, or beautiful country, which is one Chinese name for the United States. Another is flowery flag, because the stars on the American flag look like flowers to a Chinese person. So Mei Guo is American, Mei Guorin is an American person. Tong Guorin is Chinese person. Ying Guo, which sounds like England to a Chinese person, that's England. When my wife and I taught English in China, we had interpreters, and we had interpreters who, we had an interpreter, her name was Mei Mei. I said, what's your Chinese name? Because she goes by Naomi. I said, that's really pretty. And an American, remember this? No, it's very prestigious to be called by your. We also had students named Money and Mary, Merry, Apple, all kinds, because they got to choose their English name, and that's what they chose. We now move to World War II. The US is not prepared early in the war to provide its air crews with language aids. In April 1942, the Doolittle Raiders were instructed to land their B-25 Mitchell bombers and free China following their bombing raid on Tokyo. All right, they took off on aircraft carriers knowing that they couldn't land there. They knew that they weren't going to be able to land on a landing strip because they didn't exist. They were going to crash land their airplanes on a rice field somewhere and hope for the best. All right, it was like a suicide mission. It truly was what these men were asked to do, and they volunteered. One of the pilots said after the war, the Raiders were not provided any written material and the phrases they learned were not spoken where they landed. All right, my wife and I, we experienced that when we taught in China. Our Chinese classrooms interpreters came from all over China, and they spoke different Chinese dialects. So they would speak to one another in English. They could all read the same newspaper, didn't matter which dialect they spoke. This chit was made in India, ordered by the British, and paid for by Americans. It was issued to American airmen who flew over the hump. It's printed on silk with a cotton backing. The hump was given the name by Allied pilots who flew military transports from India to China over the Himalayan mountains. Flying the hump was extremely dangerous with the lack of reliable maps, no radio navigation, and no weather information. Here is a 17-language blood silk, very long. And when they got to be this long, they didn't sew them onto their flight jackets. They probably just carried them in their pockets. All right, so here's another one. This one here was mailed home by an airman and as a souvenir. All right, kind of an underlying theme here. All right, the British issued some. This is considered one of the prettiest officially issued blood chits with the British Burma flag on it, the peacock. This chit is the first of 4 made by MIS-X. Doesn't it sound like James Bond or something like that? MIS, Military Intelligence Service. It was issued in China with the flag of nationalist China. It has a number 1 down in the lower right-hand corner. Here's a number 2. These are being printed in Washington, D.C. No, oh yeah, you see the W there stands for Washington, D.C. And this number should have been gone right there because that's what this says. But the Americans printing it weren't aware of where the number was supposed to go. So that's one of the things that people look for who collect these. So number 3, and then a number 4. And these are on display downstairs as part of my Blood Chit display. Here is a 2-sided Russian Blood Chit, and the directions say in step number 5, when you encounter the Russians, we're allies, but don't go reaching for your Blood Chit. They'll find it when they search you because they're trigger happy, okay? Towards the end of the war, they didn't even put any printing on them. Early in the war, they didn't know what the American flag looked like. 4 or 5 years later, they did. Here are 2 Blood Chits on the inside lining of a flight jacket, and you can see because of the material that was used, they didn't hold up well. This chit shown here was canceled with a special stamp. Some chits were canceled when rewards were paid or when the airmen wanted to take the chit home. Back to souvenirs. I had this one on display downstairs. All the writing is embroidered. It's quilted. It's really beautiful. It's not a government issued. It was made as a souvenir for the military to purchase. They were made in India and in China. And if it's from that time period, they're very desirable to collectors. Collecting souvenirs by military personnel is something they've always done, whether it was enemy flags, handguns, knives, belts, etc. Some souvenirs were made by the locals to be sold to soldiers. This souvenir chit was made of leather. It's attached to an officer's suitcase. It has an anchor and USN. You can see it right above the anchor there, the United States Navy. Sometimes veterans wanted others to know about their military experience, but I'm sure are aware that there were a lot of veterans from World War II and never talked about their experience. And then when they got to be in their 80s, they made it a point to share their stories with their family and stuff like that. My father-in-law, Eugene C. Hess, and his brother, Joseph C. Hess, both joined the Army in April 1941. So that's a couple months before Pearl Harbor. My father-in-law was at Pearl Harbor December 7th. It was the only military action he saw the entire war. He was a captain in India at the end of the war, and this 50 caliber round was found in his footlocker 20 years after his passing. The family was afraid of it and didn't know what to do or how to dispose of it. I knew right away it wasn't a live round. It's actually a cigarette lighter, all right? And I brought it up here. It's sitting here on the table. Yeah. Ted, thank you, Vanna, Ted. All right. I also have a Gurkha knife. Close up of that. It has India, 1945. My father-in-law said he never wanted to go back to India. And my wife didn't know anything about his footlocker until after the family got it out about 15 years ago. This pillow sham belonged to my wife's Uncle Joe. It was in his footlocker. The family took it out and had it framed because it's so beautiful. For many years, the family read the pillow sham as Italy, 1945. You can see that on this side, but they couldn't make out the name of the town. Can you make out what that town is? It looks like L-O-U-R, but it's S-O-U-V-E-N-I-R, souvenir. All right. The insignia in the center of this letter T on an arrowhead was adopted by the 36th Infantry Division. In 1936, this division was known as the Arrowhead Division. It landed in North Africa, where they guarded prisoners of war. They saw action in Italy in September 1943. In August 1944, they landed in southern France and fought their way north through the Rhine Valley. This action was overshadowed by D-Day. My wife's uncle was killed by an 88 millimeter shell on August 27th, 1944. He was 30 years old. That was 79 years ago. you know, a life, and that's not an uncommon story. Wrapping it up, I want to close with a look at this painting. Who's this painting by? Even if you've never seen it before, anyone knows, Norman Rockwell. Yeah. People are familiar with his work. And I like the seriousness of the expressions on everyone's face. All right, this young Marine, and there's his picture on the wall in the background there, you know, Navy hero, and he's just telling them about his experience, and he's holding a souvenir flag there. And I'm reminded that the men who handled the blood chits that I have on display and the Gurkha knife and the rounds, cigarette lighter, they're all young men one time. And they knew they were participating in something historical. Some of them came home and some of them didn't. America's commitment to downed airmen is exemplified by their heroic efforts to recover every single pilot. Rescuers who serve in this role today live by the motto that others may live. They are among the most highly respected members of the American Armed Forces. And that's the book. So basically, I'm giving a book report and show and tell, and I appreciate your patience with me. I have this, my blood chit display, and then about a dozen flags that I purchased since the pandemic that I've never had a chance to show anyone. So if you would come down and look at them, I would really appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. And you know how we like souvenirs, right? Okay, so we all got our souvenir NAVA 57 flag. So. Oh, yeah. How many blood chits saved the lives of downed airmen? The MIS records and building, it says in the euphoria, help me out there. Yeah, all right, that's it. Of winning the war, everything was burnt and destroyed. So you don't know. Yeah, that's really disappointing, I know. What languages are the blood chits printed in? Well, the ones with the nationalist Chinese flag were printed in Chinese, but on a lot of the blood chits downstairs, it has the name of the language. And there are a lot of languages I've never heard of. I know there's one, Annamese, which is now Vietnamese, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there was Japanese, and people look at it and go, why would they have Japanese on a blood chit? This must be a fake. But Japan had occupied some countries for 20 years, and they taught the children Japanese. So because you would say, there's no Japanese person who's going to assist an American downed pilot. But yeah, there's lots of languages that are downstairs if you take time to look at. Well, it's mostly pilots and airmen. Because they would land in countries where the people didn't speak the language. You know, most of the times the ground troops were traveling as a large group. So some, I don't think any of them were shot down, but they had mechanical difficulties and they were captured and they were executed, and it was a great publicity stunt. So the Japanese thought, whereas for America, it just resolved our will all the more. They were beheaded and they took pictures of it and everything. And so the question was, did they know what happened to the Doolittle Raiders? And he was able to answer that. Yeah, well, the chits that I have are used by American pilots, and they had languages for the countries that they would be flying over, or thought they would be shot down in possibly. The very first couple missions that Americans went on, a British officer wrote down in 3 different languages, here, you might need this just in case. And it was used for the pilot to get back to friendly lines. And they used that paper for future printing of blood chits.